My name is Marin Calloway, and I walked into my sister's wedding without a hand to hold or an arm to lean on. Not because I had no one to bring, but because I wanted every step across that marble floor to be mine alone. The chandeliers above threw light like 1,000 tiny spotlights, catching on crystal glasses and polished silver. It also caught on me, on the black silk dress with clean lines, the low knot of my hair, the absence of a ring on my left hand. I could feel it before I saw it. The quick tilt of heads, the murmurs that didn't bother to wait until I was out of earshot. Laughter so soft it could have been mistaken for a cough, if not for the way eyes flicked over me, lingered, and dismissed. My sister's new in-laws clustered near the stage, their champagne flutes tilted just so, studying me like I was an exhibit that didn't belong in their collection. She came alone. One woman's voice floated toward me, bright with false sympathy. Another leaned in to her companion. Some women marry their work. Poor thing. I didn't stop walking. The room was arranged to funnel guests toward the gleaming heart of the celebration, toward the bride in her ivory gown and the groom beside her, beaming for the cameras. My sister, Eliza, didn't even turn her head when I passed. If she noticed me, it was only the way you notice a shadow crossing your path. There, and then gone. The urge to pivot and leave pressed hard against my ribs, but I didn't. I took my seat in the corner they'd assigned me, spine straight, hands resting lightly in my lap. If they expected me to shrink, they'd be disappointed. Because what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the most powerful man in the room had already seen me, and he was about to stand up. The chair they'd given me wobbled slightly against the parquet floor, a subtle tilt that made it impossible to forget I was sitting at the farthest edge of the ballroom. From here, the music sounded thinner, the chatter muted by distance, like I was listening to a party through a closed door. My place card had been tucked at the end of a table reserved for distant cousins I hadn't seen since we were teenagers. They gave me polite nods, the kind you give to strangers you're not sure you want to engage with. A waiter in a white jacket approached with a tray of champagne flutes. I shook my head and asked for sparkling water instead. He hesitated a fraction of a second too long, as if wondering if I'd declined because I was pregnant or in recovery. Anything but the simple truth that I didn't feel like toasting people who treated me like a cautionary tale. He left without comment, but not without a look that said he'd heard the whispers too. The band in the corner switched to a slow waltz, the kind that made the older guests smile nostalgically while the younger ones scrolled on their phones. Eliza and her new husband, Brandon Whitcomb, moved onto the dance floor in a practiced glide, the hem of her gown sweeping just far enough to suggest effortlessness. Cameras followed them, drones buzzing quietly near the ceiling, hired photographers snapping from every angle. The entire event was curated for display. Every flower arrangement and lighting cue designed to say, "This is what success looks like." From my seat, I could see my parents front and center. Their faces turned toward the newlyweds with a pride I couldn't remember ever being directed at me. My father's arm rested along the back of my mother's chair, his hand brushing her shoulder every so often. It was a habit he'd cultivated over years at banquets and charity galas, part affection, part performance. They thrived in these rooms, fluent in the language of small talk and implied status. I took a sip of my water, the cold glass sweating against my fingers. The condensation pooled onto the tablecloth, spreading into a slow, deliberate stain. For some reason, I couldn't bring myself to blot it away. It felt like the only honest thing in this room, uncontrolled, unplanned. A voice beside me interrupted my thoughts. "I thought you'd have someone with you by now." I turned to find one of my cousins, Sandra, maybe, tilting her head in an approximation of warmth. Her lipstick had bled slightly into the fine lines around her mouth, her smile tight as she stirred her martini with a gold cocktail pick. A woman like you, all accomplished. She let the sentence hang there, her tone balancing between admiration and faint reproach. I gave her a small, closed-lip smile. It's easier to keep my own schedule this way. She blinked, clearly not satisfied with the answer but unwilling to press. A moment later, she excused herself to find the restroom, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and the echo of her assumption that whatever I'd built for myself still counted for less without a partner beside me. From the head table, Eliza's new mother-in-law, Victoria Whitcomb, surveyed the room like a queen assessing her court. Her face didn't move much when she smiled, a careful blend of cosmetic procedures and muscle control, but her eyes were sharp, darting toward me more than once. She leaned toward a guest at her side, speaking just low enough that I couldn't hear the words, but high enough that I could see the shared smirk. The sting wasn't new. I'd been absorbing moments like this since adolescence, when my drive to learn, to build, to compete in arenas no one else in my family cared about was treated as a kind of social defect. Eliza had always been the one who sparkled in the ways they valued, her hair just so, her laughter timed perfectly to flatter whoever was listening. She was good at making people feel important. I was good at making things work. Only one of those talents had currency in our house. When the song ended, the applause rose and fell, followed by a brief shuffle as servers began delivering plated appetizers. My table received theirs last. The salmon was already cooling by the time the plate landed in front of me, garnished with an obligatory sprig of dill. Across the room, at the main table, the service was synchronized to the second. Every dish lowered in unison. Champagne refilled before the bubbles had a chance to fade. I could have stayed in my corner, eaten my food, and counted the minutes until I could slip away without making a scene. That was the role they'd assigned me. Quiet, peripheral, forgettable. But there was a heat under my skin tonight. Something that made me restless. Maybe it was the way the Whitcombs looked at me like I was a puzzle missing too many pieces to bother solving. Or maybe it was the realization that I'd spent years letting other people decide how much space I could take up. I pushed my chair back, ignoring the slight wobble, and stood. My heels clicked against the floor as I crossed to the bar. The bartender, a man with sleeves rolled to his elbows and a tired but kind expression, set down a shaker when he saw me. "Club soda with lime." "Please," I said. "You got it." As he worked, I felt the prickling sensation of being watched. Over my shoulder, Eliza was making her way toward me, her smile stretched thin. When she reached the bar, she touched my arm lightly, the way you might steady yourself before delivering bad news. "I just wanted to check in," she said. "Make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," I replied. "Why?" "You seem, I don't know, distant." I let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "Eliza, we haven't had a real conversation in 5 years." She gave that little laugh of hers, the one that hinted at an apology without ever delivering it. "Well, you're here now. That counts." "Does it?" I thought, but didn't say. She was already turning back toward the dance floor before my drink even arrived. I returned to my seat, the glass cold in my hand, only to catch the tail end of another conversation drifting from a table just behind me. "Pretty, but cold," a male voice said. "You can tell she's one of those women who marries her career," another added, and they both chuckled. The urge to leave flared again, stronger this time. My coat was draped over the back of my chair, my car parked not far from the front entrance. I could vanish, let them keep their curated night, their champagne, and their hierarchy. I owed none of them an explanation. But then something shifted in the air, a subtle pause, the kind that makes a room tilt on its axis. From the main table, I heard the slow scrape of a chair being pushed back. I turned my head just enough to see him. Lucas Arden. He wasn't dressed for show like most of the Whitcombs. No ostentatious cufflinks, no too bright tan, just a tailored navy suit, silver hair combed neatly back, and the kind of presence that didn't need embellishment. I recognized him instantly from business journals and keynote stages, a man whose decisions moved markets. He stood without hurry, his gaze sweeping the room once before settling on me. And then, in front of everyone, before Eliza, before Brandon, before Victoria Whitcomb, he began to walk toward my table. Every conversation in the room faltered, cameras pivoted, unsure whether to follow him or keep framing the bride. By the time he reached me, the only sounds were the soft tread of his shoes and the faint hum of the band in standby. Lucas stopped beside my chair, close enough that I could see the fine weave of his suit fabric and catch the faint scent of cedar and something sharper, like cold air before a storm. His eyes, pale gray and steady, met mine without hesitation. Then, with a formality that belonged to another era, he inclined his head in a full, deliberate bow. It was not the kind of half-nod people toss out in greeting. It was deep enough that his gaze broke from mine, deep enough that every conversation still clinging to life in the ballroom dissolved completely. The silence came in a rush. Forks stilled midair. Champagne flutes hovered halfway to lips. The bandleader froze with his hand on the microphone. When Lucas straightened, the corners of his mouth tilted in something between a smile and an acknowledgement. His voice carried easily, not loud but pitched to reach every corner of the room. "Ms. Calloway," he said, "it's a privilege to finally meet you. Your work at the Geneva Health Data Summit changed the trajectory of 3 major initiatives at Arden Global. I've wanted to thank you in person for some time." A ripple went through the crowd. The kind that comes when a story you thought you knew suddenly acquires a new, inconvenient chapter. Somewhere near the head table, I heard Victoria Whitcomb inhale sharply. Brandon's brow furrowed as he glanced at Eliza, who stared at me with the brittle poise of someone trying not to blink. I rose slowly, feeling the eyes of 100 guests track the movement. "Mr. Arden," I said, keeping my voice even. "That's mutual. I appreciate your kind words." He gestured lightly toward the side of the room. "Would you mind stepping away for a moment? I'd like to speak without making your evening more eventful than it already is." I caught the faint humor in his tone, the way it softened the formality without diminishing it. Nodding once, I set my glass on the table and followed him. The click of my heels against the floor sounded unnaturally loud in the hush we left behind. We stepped through a set of French doors onto a narrow stone terrace. The air outside was cool, the scent of late spring blossoms drifting up from manicured hedges below. Beyond the low wall, the city lights glittered, distant and indifferent. Lucas leaned one hand on the railing, his posture relaxed but purposeful. "I meant every word in there," he said. "I recognized you the moment you walked in. Most people in that room wouldn't understand the kind of work you do, but I make it my business to know who's actually changing things." "That's unexpected," I admitted. "Given your connection to the Whitcombs." He gave a small, dismissive shake of his head. "They're family by blood. You're someone I respect by choice." His gaze sharpened slightly. "And I suspect they've never told you the truth about what we think in the circles where decisions are actually made?" I arched a brow. "And what's that?" That you've built something most of them couldn't dream of sustaining for a month. You've taken an idea and made it a structure, one that holds under pressure. That matters more than the number of guests at a wedding or how many zeros are in a trust fund. For a moment, I had no response. The terrace lights caught on the silver in his hair, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. He looked like a man who had navigated storms without broadcasting them. I assume, I said carefully, you haven't shared this with Eliza or Brandon. Lucas's mouth quirked. Brandon barely checks his own email. He's competent in the ways he needs to be, but he hasn't had to build anything from nothing. That's a different skill set. And from what I gather, your sister has cultivated her strengths elsewhere. That last phrase was so precisely diplomatic I almost smiled. Almost. A burst of laughter floated out from the ballroom as someone inside tried to restart the party. It sounded thinner now. Forced? I wondered if they were already speculating about why Lucas Arden had left the main table to speak to me. I appreciate you saying this, I told him. But it's not going to change anything with them. They've decided who I am. And it's easier for them to keep that story than rewrite it. His eyes held mine, and for a moment I felt the weight of that steady gaze as something almost tangible. Then let them keep their story, he said. You don't need to play a part in it. We stood there in companionable silence for another beat, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. Then Lucas straightened, buttoning his jacket. Shall we go back in? I think the ripple's about to become a wave. Inside, the temperature of the room had shifted. The din hadn't quite returned to its earlier pitch. People moved in small, awkward clusters, their eyes darting between me and the head table as though trying to recalibrate some internal hierarchy. At my table, a few guests who had barely acknowledged me earlier now rose as I approached, unsure whether to offer a handshake or simply step aside. I settled into my chair without inviting either, my expression neutral. Across the room, Eliza's smile was fixed in place, but I could see the tension in the line of her shoulders. She waited until Lucas was seated again before crossing to me, bouquet trembling slightly in her hand. What was that about? She asked through clenched teeth, her voice low enough to avoid carrying. That, I said calmly. Was someone recognizing what you never did? Her jaw tightened. You couldn't let me have one day? One day? My tone stayed level, but there was an edge under it. Eliza, you've had a lifetime. All I did was show up. She blinked, a faint flush rising under her makeup, then turned sharply and walked away, the silk of her gown whispering against the floor. A server appeared with the next course, herbed chicken with roasted vegetables, and set it down as though the table might detonate. I thanked him quietly, though I wasn't particularly hungry. The evening program moved into the toast portion, with Brandon's father taking the microphone. His speech was exactly what I expected, anodyne praise for the couple, anecdotes smoothed to the point of blandness, a few attempts at humor that landed with polite chuckles, and then, almost as an afterthought, he looked toward me. And of course, he said, to all the family members who joined us tonight, even those who prefer the boardroom to the ballroom. A handful of guests laughed, the sound brittle. I set my fork down. Lucas did the same. He rose, unhurried but deliberate, and faced the room. If I may add something, he said, taking the microphone with a nod that was courteous but left no room for refusal. It takes very little talent to inherit wealth, he began. Even less to marry into it. But the woman sitting beside me tonight, Marin Calloway, has done neither. She has built value where there was none, earned respect in rooms many of you will never be invited into, and made contributions that will outlast all of us. He lifted his glass. If we are raising them tonight, mine is to her. Silence again. This time it was heavier, more final. No one laughed. I didn't smile. I didn't search for approval in the faces around me. I kept my gaze on the tablecloth, one hand resting lightly on the stem of my glass, the other still. There is something more powerful than being praised. It's being understood. And in that moment, I knew that at least one person in this room truly did. The applause, when it came, was tentative, but it didn't matter. The balance had shifted, and everyone knew it. The clink of glass against glass sounded oddly hesitant, as if people weren't sure whether joining the toast would align them with the right side of the room. A few rose from their seats. Others stayed put, eyes shifting between me and the Whitcombs. The air felt charged, like a storm building just beyond the horizon. Eliza had returned to her place at the head table, but she wasn't smiling now. Her hands were busy with the edge of her napkin, twisting it into a rope. Brandon leaned toward her, murmuring something meant to soothe, though his own jaw was tight. I sipped from my glass, not because I wanted the wine, but because it gave me something to do besides stare back at the crowd. The flavor barely registered. My mind was caught on the way Lucas had said my name. The clarity of it, free of the usual hesitation people in my family carried when they introduced me, as if it came with a disclaimer. The next toast started. Someone's aunt reciting a well-worn story about how Eliza had been born to be a bride. The words skimmed over me like water over stone. Around my table, conversation began to resume in low, tentative threads. But every now and then, I'd feel the prickle of eyes on me. Lucas leaned slightly toward me. "That could have been more comfortable," he murmured, almost to himself. "I'm used to discomfort," I replied. He glanced at me, and there was something in his expression, not pity, not even sympathy, but recognition. "That's the thing about rooms like this," he said. "They think they decide who belongs. The truth is, most of them are just renting the illusion." I didn't answer, but his words sank into the quiet place inside me that had been braced for years against slights, jokes, and the invisible walls my family had built. The band started up again, a jazzy number meant to smooth over the tension. Guests drifted back to the dance floor, relief in their movements as they tried to pretend nothing had happened. But pretending has a smell, and tonight it was thick in the air, like flowers a day past their prime, still beautiful, but already on their way to spoiling. A server appeared with dessert menus, but Lucas waved his away. "I think I'll step outside," he said, rising with the same calm authority he'd displayed all evening. Then, to me, "Care for some air?" The temptation to refuse, to avoid giving anyone more reason to talk, was strong. But there was also a part of me that wanted to walk through the room beside him, to let the image of that sink into the mind still processing the shift in the evening's power dynamic. I set my napkin down and stood. The walk to the terrace was slower this time, unhurried. I caught sight of my parents as we passed. My mother's smile was frozen, my father's gaze fixed on some distant point above the guests' heads. Neither spoke. Outside, the night had deepened. The earlier softness in the air had cooled into something cleaner, sharper. City lights glittered through the thin veil of leaves on the trees below. Lucas rested his hands on the stone balustrade, and for a while we simply stood there, listening to the muffled music bleeding through the glass doors. "I wasn't trying to make a scene," he said finally. "I know," I said. "You were trying to make a correction." His laugh was short, approving. "Exactly. Some illusions deserve to be broken." We fell into another stretch of silence, not awkward but deliberate, as if we were both sorting through the weight of the evening. When he spoke again, his tone was different, less casual, more deliberate. I have something in mind, he said. It's not a favor, and it's not charity. My company is preparing to launch a new initiative in predictive health data. Large scale, cross-border. It's complicated work. And frankly, I don't trust most people to handle the architecture, but I've read your case studies. I've seen what you've done with limited resources. I want you to consider leading the technical strategy. I turned to look at him fully. That's a serious proposition to make on a terrace at a wedding reception. It's a serious proposition, period, he replied. But the setting might make it easier for you to see it for what it is. A choice. One that's yours. Not defined by anyone in that room. The words caught me off guard more than the offer itself. I'd spent so long moving through corridors where every opportunity came with an unspoken condition. A subtle reminder of who was allowing me to be there. Here was someone placing a decision entirely in my hands. I don't answer quickly, I said. I'd be worried if you did, he replied. Think about it. We can talk Monday. Through the glass doors, the music shifted again, a slow number pulling couples back into each other's orbit. Inside, the Whitcombs were smiling for photographs, their expressions polished back into shape. But I knew, and Lucas knew, that something had been altered tonight in a way no lighting cue or floral arrangement could fix. I drew a breath, feeling the cool air settle in my chest. I'll think about it, I said. Good. He gave me a nod, and we re-entered the ballroom, the music wrapping around us like a well-rehearsed cover for the fractures still running beneath the surface. When I returned to my seat, a few people made a point of greeting me warmly, the way you do when you realize you might have underestimated someone. I offered polite nods. Nothing more. At the head table, Eliza met my gaze for the briefest second before looking away. There was no apology there, no softening. But there was something else. Wariness. Maybe. The knowledge that I wasn't quite as easy to write out of the story as she'd believed. Dessert came and went. Coffee was poured. Conversations loosened. And the party began to thin as older guests left and the younger ones moved toward the bar. I stayed until I felt the weight of the evening begin to dissolve into ordinary chatter. When I finally slipped out, no one tried to stop me. Outside, the air was cool and still, the street lamps casting long, quiet shadows. I walked to my car without looking back, the faint hum of the music fading behind me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was leaving a room in defeat. I was leaving on my own terms. The drive home was quiet, the kind of quiet that let the night seep in through the half-open window. The wind pressed against my face, sharp with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. I didn't bother with music. I wanted the sound of the tires on asphalt, the rhythm of passing streetlights, the occasional thud of expansion joints under the wheels. It was its own kind of metronome, steady enough to think against. My hands were loose on the steering wheel, but my mind kept circling back to the same moments, the bow, the toast, the look in Eliza's eyes when she realized the script had changed. And then Lucas's voice on the terrace, offering something real, without conditions. I turned into my street, a narrow lane lined with old maples whose branches met overhead in a dark arch. My house came into view. A simple two-story with white trim and a front porch that sagged just enough to remind me I'd chosen it for myself, not for curb appeal. The porch light flicked on as I pulled into the driveway, casting a warm circle onto the steps. Inside, I slipped off my shoes and set my clutch on the hall table. The silence was heavier here, but it was mine. No curated playlists, no perfumed air, no artificial smiles stretching over invisible divides. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the clock in the living room. I poured myself a glass of water and carried it to the couch. curling my legs under me. For a while, I just sat there, staring at the faint reflection of the lamp in the window. The city beyond was muted, blurred into a wash of light and shadow. It would have been easy to let my thoughts settle into resentment, rehash every sideways comment, every smirk, every small exclusion I'd endured tonight. But somewhere between Lucas's bow and his offer, something had shifted. The old ache was still there, but it felt contained, smaller, like a storm you've learned to watch from a distance instead of standing in the middle of. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from an unknown number. He was right about you. No name, no context. I didn't need either to know it was from someone at the wedding, someone who'd seen enough to rethink their own narrative. I let the screen go dark without replying. I thought about my parents, my mother's frozen smile, my father's deliberate avoidance of my gaze. I'd spent years trying to read those faces for some trace of pride, only to realize they were better at withholding than giving. Tonight hadn't changed that. It had only confirmed what I'd already known. Recognition from them would never be earned. It would only ever be granted when someone else made it unavoidable. The glass was half empty when I set it down. I leaned back, letting my head rest against the cushion, eyes closing for a moment. The room smelled faintly of lavender from the candle I'd burned earlier. A grounding scent. Lucas's offer threaded back into my mind, not as a sudden lifeline, but as a door I hadn't expected to find. I'd built something from nothing before. I could do it again, on a scale I hadn't yet imagined. And this time, I could do it without apologizing for taking up space. A memory surfaced, uninvited but sharp. Me at 16. Standing in our cramped garage with the first working prototype of a data parser I designed for a school project. My father had walked in, glanced at the mess of wires and code on the screen, and said, "That's nice, but maybe you should think about something more practical." He'd meant it as advice. I'd heard it as dismissal. If I took Lucas's offer, it wouldn't be to prove him, or anyone, wrong. That part of me was tired, worn thin from years of running laps on a track that went nowhere. This would be about something else entirely. Momentum that belonged to me. I opened my eyes. The clock read 12:43 a.m. The house was still. Somewhere outside, a car door shut and a dog barked once, then fell silent again. I thought about the terrace, the cool air, the way Lucas had stood like he had nothing to prove and everything to protect. Monday wasn't far away. I rose from the couch, rinsed the glass in the sink, and turned off the lights. Upstairs, the bedroom was dim, lit only by the spill of the street lamp through the curtains. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment before lying back, feeling the weight of the evening settle into something I could carry without it crushing me. The night had ended the way it began, with me alone, but there was a difference now, subtle but undeniable. Alone no longer meant unseen. Monday came faster than I expected. By the time I pulled into the underground garage of Arden Global's Boston office, the air was still heavy with the damp chill of early morning. The building loomed above me, glass and steel catching the muted sun, its clean lines reflecting a kind of order I'd always found appealing. I parked in a visitor space, cut the engine, and sat for a moment, palms resting on the steering wheel. It had been years since I'd walked into a meeting that wasn't about securing funding, fixing a crisis, or defending a project from being gutted. This felt different. Lucas hadn't promised me anything, not outright, and I hadn't promised him a decision. But the invitation itself had been enough to stir something I hadn't felt in a long time, curiosity without dread. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent except for the hum of the cables. My reflection in the brushed metal walls looked composed, Black blazer, cream blouse, hair down for once. It was the kind of armor I knew how to wear. Lucas's assistant, a poised woman in her 50s named Margaret, greeted me with a handshake firm enough to signal she was more than a gatekeeper. "He's just wrapping up a call," she said, leading me to a glass-walled conference room with a view that made the city below look like a scale model. I took a seat at the long table, my eyes drawn to the neat stack of folders and a legal pad at one end. Everything in the room had purpose. No clutter, no filler. I wondered if that was a reflection of Lucas or just the way he wanted to be seen. When he entered, it was without the kind of theatrics some executives seem to need. He carried only a tablet, which he set on the table before taking the seat opposite me. "Marin," he said, as though the name was an anchor. "Thank you for coming." "I'm still in the listening stage," I reminded him. "That's all I'm asking." He slid one of the folders toward me. Inside were schematics, data flow diagrams, and a short executive summary of something called the Sentinel Initiative. The premise was deceptively simple: use real-time health data to predict emerging public health threats before they spread. The scope, however, was massive. Multiple countries, layers of privacy law, the kind of infrastructure that would take years to build and seconds to destroy if mishandled. "You want me to design this?" I asked, skimming the technical specs. "I want you to make it possible," he said. "We've had teams try. They've built impressive slide decks and half-finished prototypes, but none of them could marry the scale with the security. Your work in adaptive encryption is different." I looked up at him. "You've done your homework." I don't extend invitations lightly. The conversation moved into specifics: funding models, cross-border compliance, the politics of working with governments who saw data as both lifeline and leverage. He listened more than he spoke, asking the kind of questions that told me he wasn't looking for someone to flatter him, but to challenge him. At one point, he leaned back, studying me. "You've been in rooms where people underestimated you on sight," he said. "That's one way to put it. You carry it well, but carrying it alone takes a toll." I wasn't sure if he meant it as observation or warning. Either way, he wasn't wrong. 2 hours passed without me noticing until Margaret appeared in the doorway with a discreet cough. "Your next call is in 15. Lucas." He nodded but didn't move to end our conversation. "Think about what you've seen," he said to me. "Don't decide today. If you walk away, I'll respect that. But if you don't, this could be the last time you have to build something from scratch without the right backing." I closed the folder and rested my hand on it for a moment before sliding it into my bag. "I'll let you know." As I stood, he did too, offering a handshake that was firm but not overbearing. There was no sales pitch in his eyes, no desperation to close the deal. Just the same steady recognition I'd felt when he bowed in that ballroom. Outside, the air had warmed slightly. The city felt different from up there. Less like a collection of closed circles and more like a network of possibilities waiting for the right connection. I walked 3 blocks to a cafe I liked, ordered a coffee, and took a seat by the window. I opened the folder again, running my fingers over the edges of the pages. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard my mother's voice, sharp, certain, saying I should blend in more than my father's, asking why I couldn't be a little more like Eliza, and then cutting through both. Lucas's voice. "Let them keep their story. You don't need to play a part in it." The coffee cooled beside me as I read every word. The first time I looked up from the Sentinel folder, the cafe had shifted around me. The morning rush had thinned to a steady hum. the baristas moving in practiced loops between the espresso machine and the pastry case. A couple near the door argued softly about a contractor's estimate. A college kid 2 tables over tapped a pencil against a statistics textbook. Somewhere behind me, milk hissed into foam. Ordinary life, calibrating itself around a decision I wasn't ready to say out loud. I closed the folder and slid it back into my bag. When the server came by with a fresh pot, I covered my cup with my palm and asked for the check. She tucked the receipt below the saucer, the total printed neatly above a line for tip. I added 20%, signed, and slipped my card back into my wallet. The paper made a small sound when I folded it, final in a way that had nothing to do with money. My office was a 15-minute walk, a second-floor space above a brick repair shop that always smelled faintly of motor oil and lemon cleaner. I unlocked the door, disarmed the alarm, and flipped on the lights. The place wasn't large, 2 enclosed rooms and an open area with whiteboards on every wall, but it was ours. I had built it as deliberately as the systems we designed, piece by piece, contract by contract, until the rent and the payroll were covered by more than stubbornness. Ava was already there, headphones around her neck, her curls pulled into a knot so messy it had to be intentional. She glanced up from her screen as I set my bag down. "You survived the wedding," she said. "We were taking bets." "I'm fine," I said. "Better than fine." She studied me. "You're not hedging. That's new." I told her about Lucas, stripped of the spectacle, just the facts. The bow in the ballroom became a line, an acknowledgement. The toast condensed into the shape of a sentence. The offer on the terrace was the only thing I didn't simplify. I let that one keep its full weight. Ava leaned back, eyes on the ceiling. "Sentinel," she repeated. "Ambitious, messy, beautiful if it works." "It only works if the foundation holds," I said. "Everything else collapses on contact with reality, which is why he wants you." She sat forward, elbows on her knees. "We'd be leaving a lot on the table here if you go." "We wouldn't be leaving," I said. "We'd be scaling, with their infrastructure, not against it." She considered that. "And with their lawyers." "And with their lawyers," I agreed. "Which is either a seatbelt or a tether, depending on the day." We went to the whiteboard. I uncapped a marker and drew a rectangle for the backbone. Arrows for intake. A second layer for permissions and audit trails. Ava interrupted with questions that weren't really questions, more like pressure tests. I welcomed them. If an idea couldn't survive this room, it had no business at global scale. Sometime around noon, Evan arrived with a paper bag that smelled like roasted chicken and rosemary. He set it on the table, divided the contents, and handed me a sandwich without asking what I wanted. He had learned my habits by watching, not by asking, which meant we skipped the choreography of politeness and went straight to the work. "Why is there a global health diagram on my whiteboard?" he asked, mouth already full. I told the story again, shorter this time. He chewed, swallowed, and nodded slowly. "You'll say yes." "I haven't decided." "You have," he said. "You just haven't told your mouth yet?" I didn't argue. The truth had a way of sounding arrogant when you said it too soon. After lunch, I called Margaret. Her voice came through the line crisp and unhurried. "Arden Global," she said. "This is Margaret." "It's Marin Calloway," I replied. "I have follow-up questions about Sentinel, legal architecture, data residency, oversight." "Of course," she said. "I'll set a call for Wednesday at 10. Compliance, counsel, and regional ops will join. I'll send you a draft agenda in an hour." I thanked her and ended the call. The email landed before I'd capped the marker. Bullet points marched down the screen in clean type. Names assigned. Responsibilities mapped. I forwarded it to Ava and Evan with a single line. Start a list of non-negotiables. By late afternoon, the office had dimmed into that liminal light between work and evening. I shut down my computer and reached for my bag just as my phone lit with Eliza's name. For a second. I let it ring, the sound vibrating on the tabletop. Then I answered. Hey, she said. No greeting, no small talk. Can we meet? About what? About Friday, she said. About everything. I almost told her to say it on the phone, to save us both the performance of pretending we were meeting for coffee like sisters who knew how. But something in her voice stopped me. It wasn't soft. It wasn't apologetic. It was careful. Like she was stepping onto ice she wasn't sure would hold. Where? I asked. Whitcomb House, she said, too quickly. We're hosting a brunch for out-of-town guests tomorrow morning and… No, I said. Somewhere neutral. Silence stretched thin between us. There's a diner on Tremont, she said finally. Della's. 8, ma'am. I'll be there, I said, and hung up before she could add anything that would make it harder. I left the office with the Sentinel folder under my arm and walked the long way home. The sidewalks were crowded with people carrying groceries, dry cleaning, children. The ordinary movement of a city on a Monday. The kind of movement that makes you feel less like a point alone on a line and more like part of a grid. At home. I warmed leftover soup, ate standing at the counter, and skimmed the agenda Margaret had sent. I added notes where the language got slippery, words like optimize and streamline that often signaled someone was about to try to cut a corner and call it elegant. I underlined governance and wrote independent oversight in the margin with 2 lines under it. If Sentinel was built, it would be built with guardrails I could defend in front of anyone. The house settled around me as the night came up. Pipes clicked in the walls. The neighbor's porch light flicked on and off. I set an alarm for 6:15, placed my phone face down, and tried not to rehearse a conversation with a woman who had never learned how to talk to me without performing for an audience. Sleep came, thin and practical. It did its job and left. At 7:50, Mom. I pushed open the door to Della's and the bell above it gave a tired jingle. The diner smelled like coffee and butter. The vinyl booths shining with a polish that wasn't new but was thorough. A waitress with a pen behind her ear poured me a cup before I asked and pointed to the corner booth. Your friend's already here. Eliza sat with her hands wrapped around a mug, eyes on the window. Without the gown and the spotlight, she looked smaller, younger. Not in years, but in certainty. She didn't stand when I reached the booth, just gestured to the seat across from her. I ordered you black coffee, she said, and a side of lemon because you do that thing with the peel. I looked at the saucer beside my cup. There it was, a lemon twist, bright and incongruous against the chipped ceramic. A detail she had noticed once and carried with her. It landed in me like a small, unexpected mercy, and then was gone. What did you want to say? I asked. She blinked, then reached for the sugar packets. Aligning them into a neat row she immediately ruined by sweeping them sideways. I didn't know he knew you, she said. Lucas, I didn't know he would recognize me, I said. In public? She flinched. I didn't invite him to do that. I didn't ask him to. I replied. Her eyes flicked to mine and away. Mom says you made me look small. I let the sentence sit. The waitress returned with menus and water, set them down, and rattled off the day's specials. I ordered eggs over medium and wheat toast. Eliza asked for oatmeal with berries, then added bacon like she needed to prove something to herself. The waitress scribbled, repeated the order back, and left. I'm not here to relitigate a wedding, I said. If you brought me to hear you're the victim of your uncle's manners, it's going to be a short breakfast. Eliza's mouth tightened. She looked back at the window, then down at her hands. I brought you because… I don't know, she said. Because the room changed when he said your name, and I realized I don't know yours. Not really. The coffee was too hot. I lifted the lemon twist, ran it around the rim of the mug, and set it on the saucer. The scent cut through the diner's grease and sugar. Then ask, I said. But don't ask to fix the optics of your party. She nodded, surprised, as if she hadn't expected permission. Are you going to work with him? Maybe, I said. If the terms are clean. What does that mean? It means the thing we build belongs to the people it's meant to serve, not to whoever shouts the loudest or pays the fastest. She stared at me like I'd just switched languages. Then she picked up her water, drank, and set it down with care. I was going to say I'm proud of you, she said. But that would make this about me. It usually is, I said, not unkindly. Her laugh was sudden and real, the first honest sound between us in years. Okay, she said. Then I'll say I'm listening. The food arrived, a choreography of plates and steam. The waitress slid the eggs in front of me, set the toast in a silver rack, and balanced Eliza's oatmeal and bacon with the grace of someone who'd been doing this longer than either of us had been adults. I picked up my fork. Outside, a delivery truck idled at the curb. Somewhere behind the counter, a radio talked about traffic on the expressway and a storm rolling in by evening. I have a meeting tomorrow with their legal, I said, breaking the yolk with the edge of my knife. After that, I'll know if this is a door or a wall. Eliza watched the yellow spread and soak into the toast. If it's a door, she said, will you walk through it? I lifted my coffee, the lemon oil bright against the heat. On my feet, I said, and on my terms. The rest of the breakfast with Eliza was quieter than I expected. We picked at our food, each of us stealing glances that landed somewhere between curiosity and calculation. There wasn't going to be an apology. I knew that now. But there was something in the way she didn't rush to leave, in the way she kept circling back to questions about Sentinel, about whether the people it served would know my name, whether the work would be visible or invisible. When the plates were cleared, she wrapped her bacon in a napkin and slipped it into her purse. For the dog, she explained, though I knew she didn't own one. Some habits weren't about utility. They were about not leaving empty-handed. Outside, the sky was a hard pale blue. We walked in the same direction for half a block before she stopped at the curb. If you do it, she said, don't let them change the shape of it. It wasn't advice so much as a challenge. I nodded once, then turned toward my office. The day unraveled into a blur of meetings and notes, but by mid-afternoon, my mind was already leaning toward Wednesday. The legal call with Arden Global was a gate, and I needed to know whether it opened onto a clear path or a minefield. Ava and Evan had filled a shared document with questions, many of them in bold. What are the data residency guarantees? How will oversight be enforced across jurisdictions? Who owns the models once deployed? By the time Wednesday arrived, I'd read the agenda so many times it felt like a map etched into my brain. The call started at 10:03 a.m., Margaret introducing each participant with clipped precision. Compliance, counsel, regional operations. My own team listened in, muted, but I could feel their presence behind me. An hour in, it became clear that Lucas had cleared more of the path than I realized. Non-negotiables we'd marked in red were already written into the draft agreements. Oversight was independent. Data ownership defaulted to the originating community, not the corporation. The models were locked against proprietary rebranding. At 11:32, Council asked if I was ready to commit. I didn't answer immediately, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make it clear I wasn't reacting out of gratitude or momentum. Then I said, yes, with one condition. We pilot in places that need it most, not where it's easiest. Lucas's voice came through, even though he hadn't been on the call until now. Agreed. When the line disconnected, I sat back, feeling the hum of something new settling into place. Not triumph, just alignment. That afternoon, I called Eliza. She answered on the second ring. It's a door, I said. And? I'm walking through. She didn't say congratulations. She didn't need to. Then don't look back, she told me, and ended the call. The weeks that followed moved fast. Sentinel's pilot sites were confirmed. A coastal clinic network in Louisiana still reeling from hurricane seasons that never seemed to end. A cluster of rural hospitals in Montana where winter storms could isolate entire towns. And a partner network in Alaska focused on indigenous health services. I traveled to each, meeting directors who were equal parts hopeful and cautious. In Louisiana, a nurse named Margot walked me through their storm protocols, the parts that worked and the parts they'd been patching together with duct tape and volunteer hours. In Montana, a hospital administrator introduced me to a doctor who delivered babies by flashlight when the generator failed. In Alaska, an elder spoke about data like it was a living thing, something you had to treat with respect, or it would leave you. Everywhere I went, I carried my grandfather's pocket watch in my jacket, the weight of it grounding me when the scope of the work threatened to tip into abstraction. At night, in anonymous hotel rooms, I'd set it on the nightstand, the faint scratch on its case catching the light. 2 months into the build, I flew back to Boston for a progress meeting with Lucas. His office was the same as before, clear, deliberate. But this time, he greeted me with 2 cups of coffee and no small talk. You're ahead of schedule, he said, scanning the dashboard I'd brought. You know what that means. That I've missed something? That you've built in room to go deeper? He looked up. So, go deeper. I left with a list twice as long as the one I arrived with. It didn't feel like extra work. It felt like permission to make the thing as strong as it could possibly be. That night, I walked home instead of calling a car. The city was loud, the sidewalks slick from an earlier rain, but I didn't mind weaving through it. In a storefront window, I caught my reflection. Same black blazer, same steady gaze. But there was a looseness in my shoulders I didn't recognize at first. It took me half a block to name it. I wasn't bracing anymore. The first test came on a Sunday night, 3 months into the pilot. I was in my kitchen, chopping vegetables, when my phone vibrated with the kind of alert that bypasses all settings. The header was blunt. Sentinel Early Threat Detection, Coastal Region. The timestamp put it at 6 minutes ago. I opened the secure app. A clinic in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, had logged a cluster of respiratory distress cases, all within a 5-mile radius, all in the past 2 hours. The system's algorithms had cross-checked against weather data, chemical storage reports, and ER admissions, spitting out a probability, 87% likelihood of airborne contaminant exposure. I was already moving toward my office as I hit the call button for Margot, the head nurse there. She picked up on the second ring, breathless. We've got people showing up wheezing, eyes watering, no fire, no visible smoke. But it's in the air. Seal the intake vents, I told her. Use the N95 reserves from the storm stockpile. Keep anyone stable inside until we know more. I'll call back in 5. Next was Lucas. He didn't waste time on greetings. I'm looping in state emergency response. You'll coordinate with them directly. Within minutes, we were on a 3-way call with a hazmat coordinator. Sentinel's data overlays showed wind patterns shifting inland. Evacuation orders for 2 neighborhoods went out before the local news even had a headline. By midnight, air quality readings confirmed a chemical leak from an old industrial site, one that had been marked as low risk in state records. The leak was contained by dawn. No fatalities. On Tuesday, an email from Margot landed in my inbox. It was short. They're calling it a miracle. I'm calling it proof. That same afternoon, Eliza called me. She'd seen a news clip about the evacuation. That was you, wasn't it? Not just me. She was quiet for a moment. Still, you didn't just build something. You made it matter. It was the closest thing to praise I'd heard from her in years. 2 weeks later, Lucas asked me to join him for a stakeholder dinner. It's not about money this time, he said. It's about alignment. And maybe, his mouth quirked, a little bit about optics. The dinner was at a waterfront restaurant, all glass walls and candlelight. Halfway through, one of the guests, a senator from Louisiana, raised a glass toward me. To the architect of Sentinel, she said. May we never need it, but always have it. I didn't look at Eliza, who was seated 2 places down, but I felt her eyes on me. For the first time, I didn't need her recognition to feel the weight of my own work. The flip came faster than I expected. A month after the Louisiana incident, Eliza invited me to a family brunch at a hotel downtown. It wasn't her style to extend olive branches, so I assumed there was an angle. Still, I went, partly to see what had shifted, partly to prove to myself I could walk into that kind of room without bracing. The lobby was all marble and mirrored columns, the kind of place that magnified every sound. I spotted my parents first, standing stiffly by the reception desk, and beside them, Eliza's new in-laws, the same people who'd laughed into their champagne the night I arrived at her wedding alone. They saw me before Eliza did. I caught the subtle once-over, the way their posture straightened when I walked closer. And then, like a perfectly timed scene from a film, the hotel's events manager appeared. Ms. Calloway, she said warmly. We have your table ready. The senator asked if she could join you once she arrives. The senator, the one from Louisiana. The in-laws froze, recognition dawning on their faces. Eliza stepped forward, a small smile playing at her mouth. You're early, she said, her tone lighter than I remembered. Some of us like to choose our own seat, I replied. We were seated at a long table, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Conversation stumbled over itself, polite but strained. It shifted entirely when the senator arrived, greeting me first, clasping my hand, thanking me in front of everyone for what Sentinel had done. By the time the coffee was poured, the balance in the room had tipped. I wasn't the shadow at the edge anymore. I was the axis the table revolved around. Later, as we stood to leave, Eliza leaned close. I told you not to let them change the shape of it, she said quietly. You did, I answered. And I didn't. She didn't hug me. I didn't expect her to. But she walked with me all the way to the lobby, and when the doorman opened the glass door, she let me step through the first. It wasn't an apology, but it was something that felt close enough to one, and I was finally in a place where that was enough. Conclusion. I walked out of that hotel into the kind of crisp spring air that makes the city feel almost forgiving. The sidewalk was busy, voices and footsteps blending into a low hum, but it all seemed distant. What stayed with me wasn't the senator's praise or the in-laws' sudden carefulness. It was the steadiness I felt in my own chest. Months earlier, I'd stepped into a wedding reception alone and been measured, dismissed, and quietly ridiculed. Back then, I'd thought the sting came from their judgment. Now I understood it had come from giving them the power to define me. Sentinel wasn't born from a need to prove them wrong. It came from a place deeper than that, from the quiet insistence that if I had the means to act, I had the responsibility to act. The recognition, the dinners, the public toasts, they were noise compared to the work itself. Still, I won't pretend the shift wasn't satisfying. To see the same faces that once saw me as an afterthought now searching my expression for cues. It was a reminder that sometimes dignity doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs to be lived, over and over, until the people who tried to take it from you can no longer deny it exists. As I turned the corner toward my building, I slipped my hand into my pocket and felt the smooth curve of my grandfather's watch. I thought about the years it had spent on a shelf, waiting, about the fact that it still kept perfect time. Some legacies are loud, others are quiet. This one ticked on, steady and unshaken, and so did I, because in the end, it wasn't about Eliza, or my parents, or the people who once laughed into their champagne glasses. It wasn't even about the rooms I could now walk into without bracing. It was about knowing that the work would outlast the moment, that no matter who bowed, applauded, or turned pale in recognition, the shape of what I'd built, and the person I'd become in building it, would remain. That was the only vindication I needed.